X-Men number 14 is chapter 12 in Marvel's Ten of Swords event, and while it's filled to the brim with potential, the Jonathan Hickman written issue is one of the most divisive works in his run, and a real test of the patience expected from readers as this 22-part mega crossover heads into the back half. Today I'll answer, what is Genesis, Apocalypse's wife, version of what happened to the Arakko mutants after they sealed off the demon hordes of Amenth? What new information do we learn about what's been going on in Arakko and Amenth that sets the stage for the conclusion in Ten of Swords, and why I found X-Men number 14 particularly disappointing in the Hickman era and in this Ten of Swords event. Hey everybody, I'm Dave Busing, founder and editor-in-chief of Comic Book Herald. You are listening to Krakin Krakoa number 111, part of our Ten of Swords coverage. You can find a link to the full playlist for every single issue, and of course all my theories and things that I've been adding in Krakin Krakoa in the show notes. If you like the Comic Book Herald YouTube channel or Krakin Krakoa, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing. Spoilers for Discuss Comics may follow. Writer Jonathan Hickman, artist Mahmud Asrar, and Leinil Francis Hugh, colors by Sonny Gal, letters by Clayton Cowles. Following the reveal in Stasis that Genesis and Annihilation are the same person and leading the forces of Arakko and Amenth against Krakoa in Otherworld, Apocalypse and Genesis have a moment alone in the Starlight Citadel to catch up on what really happened with Genesis in Amenth, this dimension, that sits below, if you will, Earth and Krakoa. It seems odd that Apocalypse refers to the blade that Genesis is wielding here as the Twilight Blade, and Genesis actually does the same, but when we saw the sword last, it was called the Midnight Blade in the pages of Stasis. I'm kind of wondering now, has there been a meaningful change there or not? This could be, Apocalypse would recognize the sword as the Twilight Blade from his time when that sword severed, the Okara, the nation that they founded that then split into Krakoa and Arakko. Genesis might know that it is now changed into a Midnight Blade and just not be acknowledging that and keeping that a secret. But again, we saw that in the data page in the pages of Stasis. Overall, Genesis's retelling of a mutant's history of Arakko without Summoner's misdirection didn't feel quite as additive as I imagined it might. One of the major downsides to Hickman's secret histories, this approach, is the reuse of panels and text lifted from past issues. When used so much in sequence, as we've seen fairly recently, there's a redundancy to the storytelling. That's exacerbated in X-Men number 14, where a majority of the issue's art is a replica of Leinil Francis Hugh work we've seen before in previous X-Men issues. There's just a lot to Genesis's story that feels like, yeah, we know. We've been following along with Ten of Swords. We already had this information. I do think, in terms of characterization, I really like Genesis a lot. She's so much stronger than Apocalypse, both, potentially, literally, but really just in terms of will and in terms of the survival of the fittest mantra. It makes Apocalypse definitely more emotional looking, whereas the character, Genesis is taking on what had previously been the role of Apocalypse in the world of X-Men. She's an interesting character too because it's still her. You still get the sense that this is Apocalypse's wife. He says, he is obviously emotional in seeing her again for the first time after all these years, but she's also very aware that she is controlled completely by the annihilation helm that rules Amenth, right? So it's like, it's her, but it's not her at the same time. It's kind of an echo. The newest thing Genesis adds, we do get some new information here in her telling, and immediately upon Arakko transporting to Amenth. So after the gap was sealed and the mutants of Arakko go to Amenth, hundreds of mutants lost their minds and fled into the wasteland. So like the Amenthi surroundings basically just forced them into just a chaotic scramble into the wastelands of Amenth apparently, and they say here it was 1/10 of the mutants that joined them of the apparent millions of mutants that were grown or were grown is a weirdly scientific way to say that, but that were born in Arakko over this time. The huge takeaway here for me is the immensity and scope of the mutants that were effectively lost from Earth to Amenth during this time period. Think how differently human mutant history on Earth plays out with Apocalypse, Genesis, and their mutant nation of Okara thriving without the Amenthi invasion. Plus, there's a lot to dissect here about what this age of Arakko was like. So many stories to be told about the generations of mutants that grew up in Arakko fending off the hordes of Amenth. Big picture, there's also a lot of really interesting history about what Okara was like when it existed, So the mutants who did flee were bred with Amenthi demons to produce a hybrid warrior race. So they were captured, enslaved, and then bred to produce this hybrid Amenthi mutant warrior. And this birthed the Summoners, ultimately, and what's called the Vile Schools, which we learned about. So there's some newly established world building and some questions about what this makes these hybrids, right? Do they belong with mutant kind on Krakoa, for example, since they are seemingly half mutant or part mutant, as this has gone on for generations? Presumably this also clarifies the data page details from Stasis that pointed out the pureblood status of various Amenthi-born mutants. It's interesting, but even as Krakoa and Arakko prepare to face off, I can't really shake the feeling that the Summoners and their twisted religion are the real enemies of both parties here, if they would only see it. We still don't know who was under the Annihilation Helm when Genesis took it, because she does win it in a sword fight, although honestly it might not matter. You know, we've seen in previous Hickman written issues that the helm basically just picked up any old henchy, and it didn't really matter who was under the helmet, although now, obviously, with it being Genesis, it kind of does. There's a quote here that whoever wears that crown controls the land. This brought to mind for me as something very similar to Marvel's cosmic control rod of the Negative Zone. I'm still vaguely skeptical that Annihilus, the Negative Zone, or the very loaded use of the term annihilation will actually cross over in all those Marvel cosmic ways that they, seemingly could here, but the similarities do keep appearing. One thought that I think would be pretty cool is if the helm was forged from the same material as the cosmic control rod, right? What if it's like a set of armor a la the Infinity Armor with the Infinity Gauntlet? I think that could be a cool connection where you don't actually have to bring in Annihilus and, the Hordes of Annihilation, but you do say, but it is cut from the same cloth from this, cosmic armor that allows you to tap into some of those, extra dimensional realms that are, spanning the Marvel Universe. So Genesis refuses to wear the Annihilation Helm for 100 years, but the Annihilation Hordes proved too strong for Arakko, bringing down their towers and really everything they had built in terms of this kind of amazing mutant civilization. The thing that breaks Genesis and forces her to put on the helm is the Arakko mutants and mages opening portals and seeking aid. As best I get this, in Genesis's eyes, the whole purpose of this move to Amenth was to seal the gap so that the demons couldn't infest their homeworld, this being, Earth 616 that we know, and in opening portals to other dimensions or worlds, that promise and solemn vow was effectively broken. But the absolute hole in that logic is Genesis's response is to then use the Annihilation Helm to conquer Arakko and set course for a path where Amenth conquers absolutely everything, including, of course, Earth and Krakoa. So I'll admit I'm a bit lost on the logic here, right? If Genesis is putting on the helm saying, I must put an end to this, but then by putting on the helm is absolutely perpetrating the crime she was worried about, I don't really understand why this action made her put on the Annihilation Helm. The final data page is interesting, describing what happened after Arakko fell to Amenthi hordes. So mutants of Arakko become prisoners here, essentially, held in check by Vile School Omnipaths and Vile Stealth Suppressors, as well as the Summoners. Summoners are not loyal to Annihilation or mutant kind, but instead their own power and twisted religion. I had assumed definitely that they would be loyal to the demon presence of Annihilation. There is some good teasing from Idol, our prophet here, on the Arakko mutant nation, and I'll dig into this a little bit. So the first line in the prophecy is, only under the black moon will the two become one. A black moon, and I definitely had to look this up, is the start of a new moon or new lunar cycle, effectively when there is no moon to see due to the alignment of Earth, the moon, and the sun. It is the opposite position of a full moon, right, to put that in perspective. My first thought there is, okay, it's the start of a new season. That could be the start of a new life of Moira McTaggart, right? In X-Men terms, knowing what we know from House of X and Powers of 10, that we kind of have this, get out of jail free / go into the final end game of X-Men with Moira's potential 11th life. But given how little we've seen of Moira and that she's not a player in this event and there's really not much indication that she will be, that feels way too soon, honestly. So in terms of it being a start of a new season, I kind of doubt that's a literal lifeline, but definitely I think we can anticipate, Krakoa is going to be significantly changed coming out of this event. Then we get into a white light will judge them. Now, this to me just reads like Saturnine, right? She is the Omniversal Magistrix of Otherworld. She is setting up the battle, the tournament between Krakoa and Arakko, and really seemingly has all the power, or the vast majority of the power in dictating the terms of everything that's happening. So I would anticipate that's her. I mean, other options there would be White Sword, is a really interesting character here, but again, he's just kind of part of the Arakko scene as far as I can tell. And then the final land is a red land. We'll see them split forever. I don't really have much more to go off on that one, other than we've kind of seen that language used before back when Okara was split, in the first place. But it kind of seems to contradict the first sentence of that new season, of that new Black Moon, where the two become one. If it's sequential, or if it's supposed to be sequential, or if it's just like, here are the possible outcomes of what could happen in terms of what's going to happen between Krakoa and Arakko actually getting back together again, which is, of course, the romance we are all invested in. In general, I do appreciate how Ten of Swords is selling parallel societies, the differences between Krakoa and Arakko as these mutant nations. I do quite like the idea of Arakko as a mutant nation that succeeded in many, many ways, that was quite exceptional, but then ultimately fell for these, kind of almost impossible to defend reasons of just like, yeah, but there was an endless demon horde on the horizon. I mean, I think in many ways that's a metaphor and a parallel for humanity's own building of Sentinels. It's kind of just this thing that will happen, that Moira, despite her best efforts throughout her lifelines, has seen happen time and time again. It kind of feels like an unending demon horde, right? So we get to see the Arakko laws, and again, they are very similar to Krakoa, but of course slightly inverted. Make more mutants is literally the same, but then destroy our enemies and defend this broken land is different. There's a lot of story to be told about Okara, the one land of mutants. I'm actually really interested in like a history of Okara type of series. The same goes for Arakko, for thousands of years holding back the Amenth hordes. We have these parallel mutant societies showing the ideas of Krakoa are not new ones. Again, I would like a history book of these different societies. I think that would actually be very cool. So again, as a whole though, X-Men number 14, I found like really unsatisfying. It feels like stalling instead of progress. Narratively, the conversation between Genesis and Apocalypse makes worlds of sense. But as readers immersed in this lore for weeks, it feels like deeply undesirable hand-holding from a book and creative unit that has otherwise avoided most ham-fisted exposition. I mean, I think Hickman in general is quite good and not holding, the hands of readers and saying like, let me reiterate these points that I've made, whereas this issue is very literally doing that. I just don't think it's as additive as it needed to be. There's an example here. There was some mystery as to what was said between Genesis and Iska, but here it's the most direct answer kind of possible. Just a very simple, predictable conversation that Iska asked Genesis to parley with Annihilation. I feel like we already knew that. I don't think this stems from being too in the weeds on this book and this era of X-Men either on my end. X-Men number 14, it hits the brakes just when the car started rolling downhill, and honestly it just feels like the wrong time to me. The Hickman era of X-Men is definitely all about patience, and that immeasurably difficult balance of slowly doling out answers while building thrilling mysteries and plots spinning within plots. For me, X-Men number 14 is the rare instance, at least so far, where the ideas of the book and the potential seeds don't add enough to merit this glacier slow burn. It is artistically and narratively repetitive, and that's a disappointment coming from this creative unit and what, again, has otherwise been a very good event. I do like Ten of Swords, broadly speaking. Remember, too, much was made of this event needing to expand to 22 chapters, and with a story that borders on a very special recap episode, that decision is a lot harder to justify. I'm still quite into the event and eagerly anticipating the outcome, but we're in the endgame now. It's time for the comics to acknowledge that, right? It's time to start moving forward in terms of what this story is going to mean. Now, there's a fair amount of chapters left, and next up, we have Parlay in Marauders number 14, okay? Which is going to be chapter 13 of 22. I mean, I guess to be me saying the endgame here, like, yeah, okay, literally we are closer to the middle. I get that. That said, we're in the back half. We should be moving downhill, and it doesn't feel that way based on this episode or based on this issue. So in that regard, I was let down, but such is the lot of monthly comics. I think the literal repetition in some ways is getting overused, and I would like to see a move away from that as this event in the Hickman X-Men era continues, because it's been too much too quickly. So thanks everybody for listening. As always, I am Dave. You can find my stuff at comicbookherald.com. You can find ways to support the site and Krakin Krakoa at patreon.com/comicbookherald. In particular, I do like to thank the mysterious benefactors tier. You get your name called out here if you are so inclined to join over on the Patreon. Thanks everybody there. I'm Dave. You can find my stuff at comicbookherald.com. You can find me at Comic Book Herald pretty much anywhere on social. Look for the Best Comics Ever and My Marvelous Year podcast to subscribe to for more. And if you have thoughts, if you totally disagree with me, if you're like, this issue was amazing, here's why, definitely let me know in the comments. I would love to hear it. I would love to hear different theories about where Ten of Swords is going, and just all the thoughts from the fantastic Krakin Krakoa listeners. So let me hear those in the comments. If you like listening to Krakin Krakoa, even if you don't like listening to Krakin Krakoa, but you do it all the time, you angrily listen to everything I say, please consider subscribing. You don't have to like, just, subscribe. You're clearly here anyway. So thanks so much for listening, everybody. And as always, enjoy the comics.